I got two chairs right here. Okay, what we're scheduled for right now is, I'm going to say an informal panel discussion on maybe some viewpoints that we don't always cover when we discuss these things, especially when we discuss a lot of research. So I've asked Dr. Eric Lowe and Dr. Kai Fanning to make some formal comments, and then the informal part will be for you to ask them all kinds of hard questions, which they're happy to take. I have a perfect example of this yesterday. We were in a meeting and we were talking about a study we had done, and we were with the producer, and the producer wasn't worried about what our research results said. He was, but what he was most interested in is how many pounds he could deliver in a truckload. You follow me? Which is not something we routinely think of. So that's a good example, in my opinion, of things that have to be implemented commercially that we may not be discussing here. So that's really what my charge for Kai and Eric is. So thanks for doing this. Whatever order you want to go in.
What general comments want to start with? Just
what you see for silage use, the primary refuge.
The most feedlots I work with produce some sort of a silage product, primarily silage. Quite a few feedlots put up yearlage. For the silage, being used either in growing rations or in finishing rations. A lot of that comes down to just what the initial inventory is. So if we have an initial inventory that's high, we're going to use a lot of silage. So that could, but that, as far as dry matter and growing ration, it varied obviously, but 30 to 40% probably would be typical in a growing ration, or we could use as much as we could depending on what the inventory is. In the finishing diets, it's used as a roughened source, but we always take into account what the level of starch is in the silage that then allows us to calculate what the forward dry matter is. And that aspect of determining the forward dry matter is something that I think there's more conversation to get some input, then leading to a better way of identifying what the energy content is of that silage. The shrink measurement, that's really hard. I'd love to say that it's that each feedlot allows us to get a really good calculation of the shrink, but it's hard to measure. There are instances where it's weighed in, then you measure the pounds and tons that are fed. But our shrink can be, it's 15% seems very normal, but I know that there are instances where it's much higher. Very seldomly is it a lot less than 15%. That it's really takes a lot of effort to maintain and minimize that shrink. So they look at the research you guys are showing 10% and under. That'd be fabulous, and it's just really hard to get that number, or we don't do a very accurate job of measuring that.
Kai, I'm going to try two things here. Go ahead.
Okay, can you guys hear me?
Yep.
Okay. When Galen asked me to do this, first thing I thought about was the history of the use of corn silage in our operations. 15 years ago, the corn stalks were about $15 a ton, and you could get byproducts laid into the yard for probably $20, maybe less. So we'd pretty well scrapped the silage operations here a number of years ago, but with the change in prices, that's coming back, and I guess we'd be very similar to what Eric's described to you as far as usage. We use corn silage, yearlage, high moisture corn, but then we've also got a number of operations that are using other silages, which might be sorghum, sedan grass, or triticale or something like that. I guess my experience with calculating shrink would be the same thing. It's pretty tough to calculate that. It seems like the best managed yards do a good job calculating that, and the poor managed yards don't calculate it at all. So I can't tell you what our high shrink levels are, but it's because they really don't want to know, I believe. So
One question to start off with, did that shrink as is pounds or tons in and as is tons out, or are they correcting for dry matter in and dry matter out? You gotta repeat my question, because they can't hear me.
the shrink calculation is at on an as-fed basis or a dry matter basis, and the yards would calculate that on an as-fed basis. I don't think we'd have any dry matter shrink percentages.
It's similar to what most feedlots do. It's going to be as is in and as is out.
Lunch isn't ready yet, so there's no reason to be around. Yes, sir, back in the back.
The question was, when feeding earlet, do you see a big difference in dry matter within a field or load to load within a field? Is that correct? The one example that I have of that would be a situation where it's hybrids, and one of the presenters mentioned that earlier, how much variation there is in different hybrids. And from what in this particular situation, it was very dramatic, the amount of dry matter, and that was very much attributed to the area of the field that the different hybrids were in. So that's my answer to that.
That and also weather conditions like today dry that down pretty fast, and usually we'll start out low to mid 30s, but it's usually mid to high 20s by the time we get done putting that up.
Terry?
Keith showed the triangle. Did you guys speak to that? What experiences you've had with that between a farmer, custom operator, and feedlot?
I was going to tell you to remind them what the triangle is, because they don't want to test them while they're up in front of everybody.
That's interesting, because repeat
it.
Okay. Just commenting on the triangle and how that affects some of the operations that we may deal with. The first one was that the black layer issue becomes so incredibly important. How important it is, how the energy levels and the digestibility of that cornstarch relative to black layer, and how unlucky you are if you are the first feedlot or operation that the custom chopper gets. And that becomes a bigger deal, because that's going to be wetter and potentially less yield and less energy compared to the guy that gets hit perfectly versus those that are later on. And it's always a scramble to do that, and that becomes the biggest factor in what you end up feeding for the next year, depending on where you may live relative to where your custom chopper lives. It's really a bigger deal, and I think some said 18% change in yield, depending on how within a few weeks, or within a week or days of black layer. Wow, that's amazingly valuable calculations that's got to go into looking at when you are in line to get your silage chopped.
As far as custom harvesters go, Terry, I think the packing tractors have actually improved. We've hammered that home well enough. I think that we're doing a better job packing today than maybe we did 3 or 4 years ago, because a lot of these custom harvesters will bring a packing tractor or two to go along with the producer's tractors. When I was listening to the presentations, that's just something that ran across my mind. Is I think we're doing a little better job today because of that. So.
And in full disclosure, just a second, Terry, we have a few custom harvesters in the room. I'm telling that, so make sure they don't say anything too negative. No, that I think that seems a big challenge. So what would be your proportion of clients
so I'm following up the question on that. What would be the proportion of clients that would be using custom harvesters versus owned? Does that make sense? I'm Mike, so you don't have to repeat that question.
I think I'm going to just take a stab at that, but probably 2/3 to maybe 3/4 are using a custom harvester today, and a lot of that is just the cost of the equipment. I think one of those machines is about $500,000 now, something like that. So huge cost.
I want to buy a used one. I know it's about 220.
That'd be pretty similar. The majority of the operations do use custom harvesters, and obviously it's a critical role in getting it done because they're efficient, get it done very timely, and so the majority of people do use that, and they get their crop put up in just a few days. And back to Terry's comment on the triangle. For a operation that's buying silage or buying earlage or even pricing high moisture corn from somebody else that's going to be that they're going to buy from a farmer, that becomes a big, pretty long discussion every fall about how to price things and what's going to be an acceptable arrangement on both sides of that. And that has been looked at in many cases. There's many places to look at that calculation. But that's still something we deal with every year, looking at it. But what Kai mentioned was these haylages, and there's a tremendous amount more haylage put up, it seems, with cover crops and so on. And pricing those products becomes a little bit more challenging.
And we're going to hopefully try, and Terry's going to cover that at the end. He'll give you the perfect answer. Dr. Mader.
It's always a problem. If they're going to put money into the silage crop, are they covering more today than they were 10, 20 years ago? And what are they covered with? Are they better products, better material?
Terry's question is, are they covering the silages better today than what they were? I'd like to be able to tell you yes, Terry. I'm not quite sure that's the case. We tried to put the distiller solubles on there to cover that. I don't have too many people doing that today, just a few. I'm not a big fan of that. We push guys to inoculate and to cover the silage, and it's obvious when they do. But I can't tell you I've got everybody covering the silage piles, and it really don't matter the size of the producer. I've got fairly large operations that don't cover the silage. So, but the bigger piles, you would naturally incur less shrink too.
Maybe we ought to have custom covering crews. Who wants to start a business like that? There's some work out of Illinois that Dr. Berger did with an edible cover that could be sprayed on. Yep. But it seems to me that I'm not on the panel. Any comments to that?
Go ahead. The edible cover, I don't know for sure about that, but I do know there are a few operations that'll plant wheat, or they'll cover their pile with wheat and let that grow on the top of the silage. That's just, a couple different operations, and other than it you don't have to throw away any plastic. I don't know any benefits, like Kai mentioned with the distiller solubles that's used. It adds some sort of a cover. It might repel some moisture, but I can't believe that some of these more edible covers and so on, I don't know what the penetration of water is or what that does to the top few feet of that bunker.
Garland?
I was kind of wondering if you guys had much exposure to shredlage, or, instead of just the regular kernel process, or like the kernel start John Deere makes, if you have any opinions on those processing units on the silage, the quality of feed. Dairy guys kind of like the shredlage of the kernel source, you get particle length, but as far as density, you don't really add much exposure to it.
I don't believe I've got anyone using the shredlage yet. I know they do on the dairies, but I can't say we do. We do have a large majority of the guys using kernel processors, though.
There are some people that use the shredlage, put the shredlage up. I have no, I don't have a good comparison of performance with or without it within the, with any operations that I do deal with. However, looking at what the, say, fermentation profile is of silage that's been put up, that it's shredlage or regular silage, that, I think that would probably at least shed some light on the how well it was packed and so on, or the fermentation characteristics of it. And the little bit of sampling that we've done with that, I can't tell any differentiate any differences with the way that fermented or the way that ensiled. The kernel processing aspect, though, is, we know that's a very big deal for what we perceive is going to be the digestibility of the end product. But I think a lot of that, just that consistency of the corn kernel in the rumen every day, that I hope is an advantage to the cattle with that. Now, there still are plenty of people that don't use kernel processors, potentially on their own, their owned harvester. And in that, we have to get the particle size so low to get the cob broken up so that they don't sort it. And so that would be like just one example would be, quite a bit less than half an inch of a stalk length of the chop length for that to get the kernel, the cob process to the point where they don't sort, the cattle don't sort it. So it gets to be fine silage, which obviously packs well, but the roughage value of it, the effective fiber value of that gets to be lower.
I'm going to try and touch on the kernel processing thing, but from a study perspective, not like you brought up the particle size issue and the fact that some of those parts are processed differently is good insight. But there's only 2 studies out there on the beef side that have processing done or not. Yes, sir.
Panel speak about maximum inclusion rate of silage, where that balances animal performance, well, cost effectiveness.
Well, I've got some operations that their finishing diet will be, all the roughage will be 100% silage. We've got some guys that are wanting a higher marbled meat, so we'll actually cool that diet down, put more silage in there than we normally would, but we're comfortable using silage as a sole roughage source.
But that inclusion, the question was kind of about the inclusions that you see. That inclusion would be about what percent of the diet for roughage source?
Somewhere between probably about 15 to maybe 25% on a dry basis, depending on what our end goal is.
Yeah, there are, as far as maximum inclusion rates of silage, the way that I would look at that in a finishing diet would be just assume that the silage is 50% grain based off of what the starch content of the silage is. And then whatever, just say we're going to have a 10% roughage diet, so we're going to have 20% silage in it on the dry matter basis to supply that. So it ends up being well over 30% as fed levels of silage. So it can be very high. Now, that's not going to say that's going to potentially would be the maximum performance. However, in situations where you're going to be, the feedlot has the silage that is going to be needed to be fed, those levels can be fed and get very good performance. However, how that would compare to a higher energy diet with a little bit lower roughage, I mean, that's just, I think, pretty simple to say that you can get better performance, but the overall maximum profitability for the whole farm and feedlot operation, and some of the smaller feedlots, you know, feeding with quite a bit of silage can be very, very economical.
Would that same thing hold true with the growing rations as well?
Yeah, very much. Yeah, very much so. Okay, right.
Eric, repeat the question.
Oh, yeah. The question was, would that hold up in a growing ration? It would, but then you look at what the performance that Dr. McDonald has gone through. Maybe Galen will talk about that again this afternoon. In a growing ration with a real high level of silage in it, where you end up with more and more grain, you know, that changes that quite a bit. Even though that was I know it looked like a significant difference in performance, but overall they weren't greatly different.
Yeah, I'd agree. We've got backgrounding diets that would be high silage, high byproduct type of diet. Maybe wouldn't even need any grain in it at all. So it just depends on the area of the country and the type of operation we're dealing with.
So as you get, more high moisture products, the silage and the distillers grains that you're feeding, obviously it's not fun to carry around a lot of water, but from a cattle perspective, like on a finishing diet, I mean, do you see palatability issues or other concerns with such high moisture contents in the diet?
I'm not overly concerned about
Repeat the question again, Sky. Sorry.
The question is basically moisture content of the diet and palatability. And if you monitor dry matter intake, a wetter diet tends to have just as good of a dry matter intake. The only problems we get into is if we get up into South Dakota or Minnesota and the product will freeze in the bunk. We have a little trouble there. So during the winter, we'll have to dry that up in some spots.
My comment would fall in suit with that. It's a lot of the total moisture in the diet isn't as big a concern as just what the energy content of that diet is, and then what the dry matter intake ends up being. Some of the fact of just the amount of volume of feed hauled around becomes substantial. If you can change the dry matter of the diet, so that just the volume of feed, the number of loads, those types of things become, well, obviously gets more. You increase that with a wetter diet, but as far as say like a diet that's 40% dry matter, cattle they'll eat very high level of dry matter. They'll eat that. It'll be very acceptable as far as assumed palatability based off of dry matter intake. So moisture, as long as it's the right type of moisture, which may sound odd, but it's meaning that it's not a high level of certain feedstuffs, but real highly palatable haylage, highly palatable silage. You can feed a tremendous level of that and maintain very good intakes and get what your estimated performance is or what your projected performance is. The one in the winter further north, we have to really be concerned about that, as Kai said, because it takes a long time to eat all that moisture, and the cattle have potential problems with wetter diets further north with the volume that they need to eat per day.
Yes, sir.
Going back to the kernel processor, how much is that kernel process? Is it just crack? Does it need pulverized? Some of our customers, there's just one label only cut to get them to pulverized.
The question was how fine does the kernel need to be if it's run through a kernel processor? On a beef operation, if it's cracked, that would be acceptable to me. I'd want all the kernels cracked. Length of cut, usually we'll run a 1/2 to 3/4 inch.
The way that I look at that, the degree of processing on a corn kernel, it really depends. If you just look at the finely ground corn versus coarsely cracked corn, research, there's pretty small difference in that. So to get the more starch digested, this rate of starch digestion increases, I assume, the higher higher degree of processing. So that becomes a difference of what else is going to be in the diet, depending on how finely ground or how coarse it wants to be. As long as the kernel's ruptured into multiple pieces, that's goal number one. And the length of the cut on the silage, first of all, is the kernel process. If they do or don't have a kernel process, if they don't, it has to be pretty fine so that we don't have sorting in the bunk. If there's a kernel processor, longer the better, so we can feed a higher level of silage and get the effective fiber from it, which means more than half an inch.
Yeah, and keep in mind that the more you pulverize that grain, that the shorter your chop length is going to end up being. So,
With how all that silage or earlage is processed, then you have to take into account what else you're going to have in the diet so that you account for the correct levels of roughage and what the overall diet is going to be. I'm interested to see what discussion there is on haylage this afternoon, because the rye, there's an increasing number of people that put up rye silage and oatlage, and there's a very different level of protein depending on what type of rye is put in, or potentially how much manure has been put on those fields. And it's a very large range in protein content, where I've seen rye being very, very high in protein, and the buffering capacity of it and how well that ferments really changes. And that's an area where we need to look further into that, or better potential recommendations from companies that are selling inoculants to make sure that's discussed more and more, because the rye can be overlooked even in a short period of time when that's put up, which was in May. Getting that put up and getting that put up well has to be looked at a little bit more in depth.
Yes. Here, hold on. They're talking. Go ahead.
There's a really nice publication from the University of Wisconsin on Curtner processing. If you would like to have the reference, I can give it to you. But basically, they use a series of 3 screens. The bottom screen is about 4.75 millimeters, and you can take a sample of silage and put it through, get it wet, and then put it through the sieves and measure the volume that you end up getting. And they can give you a pretty good recommendation of having greater than 70% of the starch, grain starch in there will be considered a good processing. So if you want the reference, I can give you that.
Okay, very good. Let's thank our panel. I really appreciate it, because I know every one of you wish you were up here sitting where Kai and Eric are, right? So I appreciate your honesty and input.